of the Sun King hanging on the cross is actually an old Druidic motif of the Sun King on the cruciform tree. And one could argue that the tree is also a symbol of enlightenment, or it's a symbol of the polar axis of the earth, and so on. Here we find on the Church of Scotland is that burning bush motif. And on the right, on the flag of the Church of Scotland, you'll notice that the tree is not only blazing or burning or illuminated, but it has 3 roots. Again, the number 3 representing the Druids. On the left, the picture of the Scottish Church incorporates in the design of Vesica Pisces, and also the Knights of Malta crosses. And later on we'll be looking into that symbol. Now, earlier in the introduction, in the preview, we mentioned the name of the great Conor MacDowry, who wrote extensively on the west to east movement of the elements of civilization and on the role of Ireland in the West. Well, hold on to your hats, because we're going to find out why you haven't heard his name and why his works have been suppressed. We're going to get into the reason for that right now. He wrote in his book, which is entitled The Bible, an Irish Book, that Christianity came from Judaism is acknowledged by churchmen, but it has never been truthfully divulged before where Judaism had its origins and home, or who were the Hebrews and the Jews. The term Hebrew and Jew, for deceptive purposes, has been conferred upon a people of Aramaic race, and it is a misnomer to call this people the modern so-called Jews. Well, where did the word come from? The word Jew is actually a derivation or corruption of the word you, because as we said in the past, certain consonants and certain vowels were interchangeable, and we see this in Hebrew. It's a known fact that Y and J were often interchangeable. So Judah or Judah or Judaic, their origin is with the language of the trees. Specifically, the word Jew comes from the yew tree. One of the most sacred of all trees in Druidism was the yew. The taller and thinner variety of yew, similar to the cypress, known as the Fastia Giata, grew abundantly throughout Western Ireland and was sacred to the ancient warrior queen and goddess of the Tuatha De Danann, Banva, after whom Ireland was once named. Botanists believe all other yews in the world to be descended from 2 Irish trees. County Mayo comes from the word meaning yew forest. Interestingly, the most sacred Egyptian groves, orchards, and temple precincts appear to have had these Irish yews in pride of place. According to Ralph Ellis, the yew was the Egyptians' original tree of life, and it featured prominently in Egypt's most sacred mystery school traditions and initiatory rites. It was a symbol of death and underworld rites. The oldest implements in the world, dating to over 50,000 years ago, were made of yew wood. The tree may have been considered sacred because it poisoned all animals that ate of its bark or leaves, except the stag and deer. The deer and the stag were supremely sacred, of course, to the Irish Druids. Now the yew can still frequently be found in British churchyards. Given that the yews were older than Christian churches, it follows that Christian churches and cathedrals were deliberately positioned near to the tree for symbolic purposes. A study of the yew tree serves to confirm the west to east movement of the elements of religion. The last letter of the Irish Ogham alphabet was I, and that letter was connected to the yew tree. The letter turns up as the Hebrew Yod, the first letter, which we find in the name of God, Jehovah, whom Moses suggestively met at a burning bush. The word yew may be connected to the word Jew, from Yahu or Judah. So, were the Jews, the so-called Jews, originally men of the yew, that is, initiates of Druidic colleges? So the letters were interchangeable. Ayu, Yua, Judah. We need to look at the etymology, keep our minds on the history of these words, and cuts through a lot of disinformation. Then we can look at another tree which was sacred to the Druids, the rowan. Just as the word Jew derives from the word for yew tree, so does the ancient name Levi, L-E-V-I, or Levite, come from the Gaelic letter L, which was known as Louis or Lewis, and which can also be rendered Louis, L-E-W-I-S, or Louis, like in the French Louis. L, the letter L, or Louis, as it's known in Irish, was the third letter, there's that number 3 again, of the Irish alphabet. It referred to the rowan tree that was most sacred of all the trees in Irish Druidism. Each berry of the rowan tree bears a minute pentagram. So Levi, Lewis, Louis. We already spoke of the Isle of Lewis, which was sacred to the Druids up in Scotland. Well, where does this word Lewis come from? Lourdes in France, L-O-U. Lewis, Lewisham. It's the third letter in the sacred alphabet of the Druids, and it referred to a tree, the rowan tree. So what's this connection between the ancient pantheons of the Jews? Is there something, why did Moses meet God in front of a burning tree, a burning bush? Why not at a well, you see, or some other location? Why did the editors and scriptors of the Bible insist and write this in? Because they knew how important tree symbolism was to the ancients, to the Egyptian priests, and to the Irish Druids, and also to the Babylonians and Sumerians. They knew what we're not supposed to know. Like we said earlier, the significance of these religious tropes, these religious traditions. We find them in the Bible, but we don't notice it. There's a tree in the Garden of Eden story. In the very book of Genesis, there's a mention of an oak tree, and the burial of all the gods are buried by the prophet under an oak tree. This is what we said earlier, symbolic language. It's metaphorical, it's mythological, it's sidereal. In the book released this year, Astrotheology, again there's a whole chapter. In chapter 19 there's a section, a very important section, on the symbolism of the tree, and how the tree was the seminal and cardinal symbol of God, and also of Goddess. It's something that we need to deeply look into, is the significance and symbolism of the tree. The worshippers or keepers of the rowan were known as the Louis, L-E-W-I. And this is the origin of Levi, or Levi, L-E-V-I. It's where the word Levite originated. But who were the Levites? They were the priests, teachers, and instructors. The biblical Levites adopted the old Druidic title as their own, either because they had descended from the Western Druids, or because they were initiates and adepts from Druidic, Chaldean, or Ammonist colleges. That's right. Look up the word Levite when you're dealing with the 12 tribes of Israel, and you'll find that they were a tribe set apart. They were very special. They didn't operate like the other tribes. Their banner, their flag, their insignia, and their customs, their duties were very different. They were legalistic. They were the judges of the tribes of Israel. And they were the ones that Jehovah imparted the oral tradition to. Because remember, in the Bible we talk about we hear Moses received the law, the 10 commandments. But we also hear about an unspoken oral tradition handed down to the priests, to the Levites. And little more is ever said about that. But we find that this then becomes the backbone of Judaism. But we're not told what that law is. That becomes the foundation of the Torah and the foundation of the Talmud and the foundation of Judaic religion. And of course we surmise that it also found a home. It's also key to Christian ideas. But the very presence of a tree, the very fact that we see this, to the educated person, to the one who's done their homework, what you're dealing with here is Druidism. And in the Astrotheology book, chapter 1, we also show this. How many passages, literally we have lists and lists of passages from the Bible, from the New Testament, showing the Druidic tropes and elements and motifs that the average reader is completely unaware of. But of course, the intelligent ones of the world, as I said, They've questioned these things. They know better. They know that there's an untold story. Sigmund Freud, in his very, very important book, Moses and Monotheism, and this is a book that I deal with in Volume 2 of the Irish Origins of Civilization. We deal with Sigmund Freud and his great discoveries. He said, among the greatest riddles of Jewish prehistoric times is that concerning the antecedents of the Levites. They are said to have been derived from one of the 12 tribes of Israel, the tribe of Levi, but no tradition has ever ventured to pronounce on where that tribe originally dwelt, or what portion of the conquered country of Canaan had been allotted to it. They occupied the most important priestly positions, but yet they were distinguished from the priests. A Levite is not necessarily a priest. It is not the name of a caste. Well, we find also the city of Maliwi, or Maliwi, or Maliwi, which turns up in the Nile. The great city of Maliwi, the city of the Jews, the so-called Jews, was a city on the Nile. So we've got yew trees, we've got the tradition of the trees, we've got temple structure, the pylons are tree-like, and we've got the origin of the Jews and the Levites. And of course, if people are familiar with the work of Ralph Ellis and Mustafa Gadala and Ahmed Osman, they'll know that it's no longer a secret about the origin of the 12 tribes of Israel. The Isle of Lewis in Scotland was a Druidic centre. The place names Lewisham and Lewis derive from this root. Additionally, the supreme sun god of the ancient Irish was Lu. There it is again, L-U-G-H. He appears globally as the English Lud, and Lud, L-L-U-D, is where we get the word London. So the word London was originally Ludunum, and where St. Paul's Cathedral is, that was the ancient temple of the sun god. Now it's got a Christian cathedral on it. It was originally near the Fleet Street. A key position in London was dedicated to the Irish god Lu, but his name can be spelled L-U-G-H or L-L-E-W, and so forth and so on. In Sumerian we have the Lugal, in Welsh Lu, French Lugos, Italian Logos. A logos is a word that means meaning, means truth and understanding. He appears in the Christian canon as Saint Luke, L-U-K-E, the patron saint of surgeons and healers. As I said, the word London comes from Ludunum, meaning Lu's hill. Lu's temple is now the site of the Christian St. Paul's Cathedral. The rowan tree may have been given its name Lewis due to it being sacred to Lu, who connects to the tree as Odin, the Norse Odin, connected to the great world ash tree, or as Zeus was connected to the great oak tree. The duplicitous historians and clergy know that the real meaning of the title Hebrew had to be obscured. It was noted that the word was similar to Apiru, which referred to thieves, wanderers, and vagabonds, or to simple shepherds seeking refuge in Egypt due to droughts. Such refugees did exist, and were bound to sustain themselves in Egypt by performing menial tasks. With the letter H added, we have Hapiru, making a word that could easily be mistaken for Hebrew or Hebrew. But the Apiru or Hapiru were not the same people as the Hebrew or Ibaru or Abaru, the wise ones and counselors to Pharaoh. Now the Irish or Aryan Magi had journeyed far and wide and had established mystery schools throughout the far-flung corners of the globe, in every empire and major city. The early Egyptians knew them as the Shem Suhor, or disciples of Horus. And a while ago we came across that when we looked at Albert Churchward's discovery of the parchment that talked about the builder and the designer of the Great Pyramid in Egypt, and that this man was of the company of what he called the disciples or the followers of Horus, Horus being the falcon-headed sun god, from which we get terms like hour, hours of the day, the Horus, the horizon, the great sun god of Egypt. Well, the Shem Suhor, here we have them again. The Shem Suhor are the Druids in an Egyptian context. They existed in pre-dynastic times. They were temple builders, they were astronomers and astrologers. They were teachers, and they were the ones who are the primordial Hibaru, not the Apiru, that just simply meant a visitor to your land, a refugee. And it's known by historians that there were great famines, that Egypt was the breadbasket for all people in the surrounding districts and lands, from as far away as Mesopotamia, as far away as Palestine. In times of great famine, they would all descend on Egypt, hoping to be looked after, you see. And there was also on Santorini, the eruption of Mount Thera, which has now come to light, which also caused devastation in that region. And again, Egypt, although Egypt was shaken desperately itself, all the people of the surrounding countries looked to Egypt as the breadbasket, looked there for their survival. So, Egypt had severe immigration problems of its own during that time. But the word Hebrew can also be traced to the Gaelic Heber, or Eber, meaning the fire or the sun. A Hebrew or an Iberu was a priest of the sun. We're talking solar cult here. The word did not refer to a race or nation, as we've been told by duplicitous historians. It actually referred to the caste of Druidic elders and to their gnosis. It also referred to their sacred language and alphabet. A Hebrew, then, was one conversant with the sacred knowledge. To be precise, the knowledge of the stars. Arthur Diott Thompson, in his monumental work entitled On Mankind, Their Origin and Destiny, wrote, "Hebrew, in short, is the language which enables men to pass from one meaning to another, which explains, interprets, gives the allegorical meaning. By Hebrews, therefore, Moses does not mean the Israelites, but men, Israelites or Egyptians, who were learned in the Hebrew language, in the knowledge of Ambres, the initiated and the initiators." The Reverend Robert Taylor, in his book The Devil's Pulpit, he wrote, "The initiated who had passed through all the inferior grades and attained the highest rank of autops, or eyewitnesses, were called by the whole pagan world Israelites or Hebrews. The name of Israelites, Jews, or Hebrews did never designate a political or national body, but were the name which, from an infinitely remote antiquity, designated the highest order of the initiated into the holy mysteries, and to whom alone were committed the oracles of God." Now we start to see why the works of such people as I'm mentioning was suppressed. Now we know what earth-shattering revelations come when you delve into the subjects of etymology and philology, and you discover the true facts. So in short, the ancient name of the land of Ireland was Hibernia. Okay, so the ancient name for the land of Ireland was Hibernia. And the Irish were often known as the Hibernians. This is a Gaelic word, and it also denoted those tribes that inhabited Spain. In fact, Spain's olden name was Iberia, because the letter H is often silent. In short, the original Hebrews were the Irish. So Hebrew turns up as Iberu, Heber, and we find out that the ancient name of Ireland was Hibernia. And this is not because that name was brought by Easterners to the West, as some scholars maintain. No, it's because that term was the word that meant the Iberu, the land of the Iberu. It was taken west. It was known throughout the whole world. And the Egyptian language confirms what we are saying about these intriguing terms. In Egyptian, the word Ibre, meaning, like the Hebrew Eber, refers to rivers and to water. The reference here was most probably to the Nile and to the schools of the Hebrew that existed along that great river. With the letter H added to the beginning of the word, we have the Eber, meaning men of the river. Rivers were always considered sacred to the ancients. The Rhine River, for instance, takes its name from the Germanic word Rhun, meaning sacred knowledge or source of wisdom. Men of the river, therefore, refer to those of the underground stream of hermetic knowledge. In the papyrus of Hunefer, of the Egyptian Book of the Dead, we see Osiris enthroned upon the sacred river, or pool of water, from which arises the papyrus plant with the 4 sons of Horus. So whether you're talking about the Indus, or the Ganges, or the Saraswati, you're talking about the Nile, or you're talking about the Rhine, or any other river, river was always sacred. This is where a lot of communities developed. This is where the mystery schools are. This is where the temples were built. This is why the symbol of the river is found in Washington, D.C., with the obelisk and the Washington Capitol. This is why you see the river running past the Houses of Parliament. This is why you find it running past Notre Dame, the Seine River. Look at the buildings. We take it for granted. We don't give it any thought. It's just something to take a photograph of, picture, postcard stuff. Do we ever think about the designs of cities and why certain statues, obelisks, Egyptian sphinxes, monuments, sacred sites? Just take a trip along the Thames and make sure you bring your etymology pen and notepad with you, because the names, even the names of the towns and locales along rivers like the Thames, for instance. What about the Mississippi in America? So the symbol of the river is another, just like the tree, very, very important symbol. And as we said, Egypt was called the land of the tree and the serpent because they understood that their river looked like a tree. These two symbols go hand in hand. And Dr. Alfred M. Lilienthal, in his book, The Jews Are Not a Race, he wrote, "The descriptive name Judaism was never heard by the Hebrews or Israelites. It appears only with Christianity. Flavius Josephus was one of the first to use the name in his recital of the war with the Romans to connote a totality of beliefs, moral commandments, religious practices, and ceremonial institutions of Galilee which he believed superior to rival Hellenism. When the word Judaism was born, there was no longer a Hebrew-Israelite state. The people who embraced the creed of Judaism were already a mix of many races and strains, and this diversification was rapidly growing." Okay, so we owe it all to historians as duplicitous and as fraudulent as Josephus Piso, Flavius Josephus Piso, who just pulls this name out of the thin air, tags it and attaches it to something that it has no business doing, and the world then merrily goes on its way. We never ask, we never stop and say, what was the ancient meaning of that word? Where did it come from? Because when you do that, when you are a Conor McDarry and you do ask these questions and you find out such a fantastic story, an alternative story of history, look what opens up. Look how many lies fall away. Earlier we mentioned that one of the most important questions regarding Atlantis, Lemuria, and the pre-Diluvian civilizations that are mentioned in the world's cultures and specifically in the mythologies and folk traditions is what happened to them. And we addressed the idea of the age of catastrophe that wrecked the world, and that we emphasized it was a global disaster, a global calamity. So let's turn now to the age of catastrophe to learn something about that period of history, of ancient history. In my work I've mentioned that the campaign to have the world believe in the east to west transit of the elements of civilization was made considerably easier since the great land bridges that once existed between Ireland and England, and between England and Scandinavia, or the continent, have long since been submerged. Well, this is a very, very important note here, because, again, we've emphasized at least 2-3 times that the world doesn't look the way it did in ancient times. That goes for the borders of different countries, it goes for the coastlines, you see, and it goes for the positioning of islands. So when we look at the map today, when we look at a globe and we see England, we see Ireland, and we're used to looking at that and we're used to these shapes, how different it would be if we could see the world when the seas weren't as high, when the oceans had receded, and the great changes that geologists know can happen when sea levels rise. We have to keep in mind that when we look at the maps of the world, that is a very recent picture of topography, of geography. We always must bear this in mind. It's another area that we've grown accustomed to, but when we think back to ancient times, things could look very different. Now, the loss of the land bridges and the rising of the waters is a frequent motif in the world's myths and legends. Science is now finding out that many of these myths relate to physical phenomena. The loss of the land bridges made Britain and Ireland appear to be remote, and an aura of otherworldliness grew up around these lands. And that's true. One thing about reading the legends or reading the historians when they talk about the Western Isles, I mean, we know that this concept was pretty extreme in the sense that even until quite recent ages, people believed the world was flat, and that if you traveled in a boat or a ship too far west, the idea was you're going to fall off the edge of the world. And we laugh at that today. But this was a ploy to prevent explorers and men of wealth from funding and participating in trips that might take them to the Western Isles. And that would have then meant, of course, earlier discovery of the significance of the Western Isles. And the otherworldliness, that sense that there was something forbidding or mysterious. Ireland and England were often called the land of the gods. A lot of people believed that these lands were inhabited by strange animals and demons and so forth and so on. And this aura of otherworldliness grew up. We sense this in the various myths that deal with Avalon, or with the Lyonesse and the mysterious Lost Isles, which Celtic and Irish mythology is so full of. But you see, once upon a time, as we heard Commons Beaumont earlier mentioning, that maybe only a small estuary separated Scotland and England from Scandinavia. What happens if these land bridges, which now geologists know existed, between England and Ireland, and also between England, western coast of England, and the eastern coast of Scandinavia or the continent? What happens if it's discovered later on that there was a land bridge between southern England and France? As we said, that changes what we know about the topography. But what it also does is it makes places that are now very remote, like for instance the Shetlands, like the Isle of Lewis, like the Orkneys. Yes, they're remote and wild and desolate now, and we could never think of those places being anything to do with a cradle of civilization or a cradle of language and writing and customs. Of course not, because this is again this sort of implanted idea that we have about the topography and the geography of Europe and Britain. But the understanding of these land bridges, which takes us into the realm of science, which takes us into the realm of geology, takes us into the realm of Professor Erlingson, one of the greatest geologists who's researched this idea and wrote a book called Atlantis in Ireland. And it takes us into a fundamental reevaluation of the remoteness and the wildness and the otherworldliness of lands, and maybe that is a propaganda story that grew up after the great cataclysms and the reshaping of the globe. The loss of the land bridges. As I said, it's mentioned in the ancient cultures. From the Song of the Flood, of the Hopi Indians of North America, down in the bottom of the sea are the proud cities and the worldly treasures corrupted with evil. So there again, another motif. They're not just talking about physical calamity. Every time you're reading an account of this devastation, you're reading also about moral turpitude, a moral falling off, some sort of spiritual unraveling. Dudley Wright, in his book Druidism, The Ancient Faith of Britain, he says that traditions of the submersion of cities beneath the various lakes of the country are still current throughout the whole of Wales. The annotator of Camden mentions the names of no fewer than 6 lakes in which ancient cities are reported to have been submerged. From the Zuni Indians of North America, in one of their legends they say that earthquakes shook the world and rent it. Creatures turned fierce, becoming beasts of prey, wherefore others turned timid. Wretchedness and hunger abound. Black magic, war, and contention entered into the hearts of men and creatures. We've been saying from the outset here about this falling off, this moral falling off. We've also hear the legends talking about this, and the coming in of contention and corruption and wickedness. And underlying all of that, of course, is the idea of a trauma that beset consciousness. This is central to my work. and we dealt with it extensively in the Atlantis book and Atlantis DVD. What happened to man?